Alright, I want to give my bid on Carbon, which is an API of sorts now, but was really a major API for OS X, more so than the past. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that there's a few videos and comments that I believe should be answered and or add a little bit more information out there to what Carbon represents, because it certainly represents different things at different stages of OS X's history. It originally has parts of APIs that even belong to OS 8 and then into OS 9, and indeed was a way to bring those APIs and subsets thereof into OS X. The reason being is that OS X predominantly wanting to use a language called Objective-C, which a lot of Apple developers will tell you is predominantly rampant in the Cocoa API. There weren't as many out there when OS X first started, you could say, and it was certainly built up. And when Cocoa and different layers of OS X were being built, Apple has made a progression to using Objective-C to become its major API, which Cocoa is its major API now and the preferred API. But what Carbon is an API via the language of C. That is where I myself come into play and say, look, it's ridiculous to call the C language legacy or classic. It's just that the name Carbon is dubbed as having parts of its API to, in fact, help bring the development over from OS 9 into OS 10. But it doesn't deny the fact that it is a C language API and a way into a programming interface into OS 10 via the language of C versus using Objective-C, or if you wanted to use Python or something else, Java within OS X. There are quite a few development companies out there that prefer to use C. It is a procedural type programming versus object-oriented programming, to dumb it down in simplistic terms. And yes, there are arguments for procedural versus object-oriented programming. I'm not going to get into that in this video. But I want to clarify that Carbon is a way into OS X via the C language, not just a bridge or a means of containing APIs from OS 9 to bring them into OS X. So, for example, Adobe, which I have had a video on it, and they're not my favorite company. I was simply in this past video, which I do have quite a few comments on my Adobe video where I think I was in debate with a couple users about. It wasn't about defending so much Adobe. It was really defending the C language, because I can't stand to hear that, oh, well, C is classic, C is legacy, when the majority of the underwork of OS X is written in C. It's ridiculous. So, to me, I'm going to come off as it's rubbish. Sure, we can get rid of the parts of Carbon that no longer need to support OS 9's subsets in, but don't cut off the means of developing via C. And to furthermore, I'm back on Adobe, because Adobe said they had an argument with Mac, and I know that Adobe had said some very mean things about Mac users and didn't want to really change over their way into OS X. They didn't really want to change their software from C to Objective-C. One, it's a costly rewrite, and two, you have to have personnel that know Objective-C to rewrite the software there. So these are things to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean that Apple is correct in always in doing what they're doing. They made Cocoa 64-bit, and they still have some Carbon support, but there are developers out there that really want to have Carbon. Microsoft certainly has a lot of APIs into their system. I mean, it's a gamut of them. Of course, I'm not a big fan of the .NET framework, and that's one of the major. That is the major framework for Windows now. But let's just not forget the C language and call it legacy and classic and all this other stuff. While part of Carbon's API was to bring over parts of the OS 9's development into OS 10, it really is a programming interface in the language of C to OS 10. And I'm not going to argue with Apple in saying, hey, they want to have Cocoa as their primary or preferred API for their operating system. That's fine. But I'm not going to be one to say and dismiss C all out. So that was what I wanted to give. Thanks for watching.